Good afternoon, everyone. And some of you, it's probably still morning time, depending on where you're joining us from, or maybe even good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar titled Recognizing Human Trafficking, brought to you by the Adolescent Health Initiative in partnership with the Bronx Human Trafficking Task Force. My name is Aubrey Huff. My pronouns are she, her, and I will be moderating today's event. I am a woman with white skin, long brown hair, and blue eyes, and I'm wearing a light and dark gray fuzzy sweater, and I'm sitting in my home office with my background blurred. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. First, the transcripts are available for this webinar. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website, and the recording will be sent to participants and registrants of the webinar. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Your questions will be answered during the Q&A portion of the webinar at the end of the discussion. For any questions that we are unable to get to, we will have our speakers provide written answers, and those will be provided to you as well. All right, moving on to our agenda. This is a quick overview of the agenda. Today's presentation offers an exploration of human trafficking of adolescents, including the definition, types, and different types of trafficking and smuggling. Discussion focuses on identification of traffickers and recruiters, locations frequently associated with trafficking, and methods of recruitment. Emphasis is placed on how to recognize the indicators of human trafficking, needs of victims and survivors, and barriers to care. Using a video depicting a case of trafficking in a medical setting, a group discussion is encouraged to further explore participants' experiences, concerns, and questions. Current legislation and legal response is described as the interagency collaboration in the Bronx. For those unfamiliar with Adolescent Health Initiative, or AHI, we are based out of the University of Michigan, and we provide training, technical assistance, consulting, and resource development to healthcare providers, health systems, and youth-serving organizations across the country. Our vision is to transform the healthcare landscape to optimize adolescent and young adult health and well-being. I'd now like to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Peter Sherman, whose pronouns are he, him, his, has been the chair of Bronx Care Pediatrics at the Bronx Lebanon Hospital in Bronx, New York since 2013. He is also the director of the Bronx Human Trafficking Task Force, which he founded in 2020. Dr. Sherman holds the position of Associate Professor of Clinical Pediatrics at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York, and holds certifications in General Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine. We are proud to share that he is also the recipient of the Adolescent Health Initiative's 2023 Excellence in Adolescent Health Award. Diane Strom, whose pronouns are she, her, has spent her entire career with clients in the South and Central Bronx who are in need of support around various medical conditions. This has included provision of social work services to dialysis patients, developing and acting as administrative director of the Bronx Care AIDS program, and most recently becoming the Assistant Director of the Bronx Care Department of Pediatrics for Grants and Community Engagement. In addition to the work at Bronx Care, Ms. Strom has been an adjunct lecturer at Lehman College Department of Social Work and Department of Health Sciences for more than a decade. She has been working in the Bronx Human Trafficking Task Force for 3 years and has recently taken on the role of coordinator. I will now turn it over to Dr. Sherman and Diane Strom to deliver today's presentation.
All right, thank you, everyone.
I can start, okay. Hi, everybody, I'm Diane Strom, and welcome to today's presentation. We're very excited that so many people are interested in learning more about human trafficking because it is very necessary to get these ideas more commonplace. So our first objective is to increase your level of awareness about human trafficking in youth in the communities where you live, work, and spend time. Secondly, to expand your ability to identify and to respond to youth with who have the potential or are current victims or survivors of human trafficking, and to equip you with the knowledge necessary to teach colleagues, patients, and others about youth and human trafficking, including the youth themselves. Yeah, that's good.
Is that the line there? Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Okay, so the best way to start off is to be coming from the same position on what our definition is. And so the definition of human trafficking is a form of mental or physical confinement where some people profit from the control and exploitation of their victims who are used for commercial sex or labor purposes. And when we talk about physical confinement, it's very easy to think about what that means. We very often think about ties and ropes and chains and handcuffs and that kind of thing. But also very prevalent is mental confinement, and we really have to focus on that as well, because mental confinement means that even though the individual may be free to move around, emotionally, psychologically, they don't feel at all free, and they're very worried about doing anything that their trafficker might object to. Okay, so as defined under the US federal law, victims of human trafficking can be divided into three populations. The first is children under the age of 18 induced into commercial sex. And I really want to focus on that for a moment because under 18 is a very key number. Under 18, people are considered minors. And the rules for minors are different from the rules for everyone else. Adults who are 18 and older are considered victims of trafficking, but they have to be induced into commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion, which we'll talk about more in a few moments. And also children and adults induced to perform labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion. Okay, so what exactly are we talking about when we talk about force, fraud, and coercion? Force, very easy to picture: rape, beating, constraint, confinement. And confinement can mean just being locked in a room. It doesn't have to involve any other kind of constraint, no ties, no chains, just being locked in a room, can't get out. Fraud is deception, used by traffickers to recruit and entrap their victims. And this includes false offers of employment, marriage, or a better life. And this is something in youth that is very frequent. This is when someone might say, I love you so much. I want to be with you forever. And they encourage that person to form a relationship with them. And then shortly thereafter, for example, they may have a friend coming from out of town. Please spend the night with this friend just this once. If you love me, you'll do this for me just this once. And then little by little, that becomes frequent, not just once. So that's the fraud. And then finally, coercion may involve serious harm or physical restraint of any person. It can be a scheme or a plan or a pattern that causes the victims to believe that if they don't perform a particular act, it will result in some kind of restraint against them, but also their families, or a threat of legal process, or threats to reveal immigration status. So if someone is not here documented, then their trafficker may say, if you don't do what I'm saying, I'm going to call the authorities. Or I know that your parents are not here. We're going to call the authorities. Okay, so specifically focusing on minors and sex trafficking, any minor involved in sex trafficking is considered to be a victim of sexual abuse. Force, fraud, or coercion does not need to be proven for anyone under the age of 18, male or female. Okay, one thing that happens is that there's confusion between trafficking and smuggling, and they're actually quite different. Just to differentiate, trafficking must contain an element of force, fraud, or coercion, whether it's actual or just perceived, unless the individual is under 18 and involved in commercial sex acts, versus smuggling, where the individual is generally cooperating. They're trying to get from point A to point B. In trafficking, it generally involves forced labor and or exploitation. And there's no implied coercion in smuggling, again, because the individual is cooperating. In trafficking, people are considered victims. In smuggling, people are complicit in the smuggling crime. They are not necessarily victims of a crime, although they may become victims once they arrive or once there is exchange of money. In trafficking, the individual is enslaved, subjected to limited movement or isolation, or very frequently have had their documents confiscated, versus smuggling, where people are free to leave, change jobs, etc. Generally, when they arrive at their destination, they're free to go. Again, sometimes that changes and it becomes trafficking, but that's not the intent from the beginning. In trafficking, we need to have no movement necessarily. As I said, a person can stay in one room and never move. Even though the word trafficking would make you think that it involves movement, it doesn't. Whereas smuggling does involve movement. It involves the illegal entry of a person from one country to another. There is no requirement to cross any international border when we're talking about trafficking, but smuggling always crosses an international border. And in trafficking, the individual must be involved in some kind of labor or commercial sex act in order to be working. They have to be working all the time. Whereas in smuggling, the person must only be in the country attempting to enter illegally. So trafficking is really a crime against an individual, whereas smuggling is a crime against a country. But what's important to remember in both cases is that both crimes are making money, a lot of money for someone. A lot of people are getting rich on both. Okay, so in 2000, the United States passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And it's a federal legislation, and it defines labor trafficking as the recruitment, the harboring, the transportation, the provision, meaning providing it to someone, or the obtaining, the person who gets it, of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, and coercion, as we just defined, for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. And they are all really slavery. Debt bondage specifically has to do with if the individual owes money or the family owes money. Often they will be put into bondage until that debt is paid off. Sex trafficking is defined as commercial sex, and that is a sex act in which something of value is exchanged, for example, money or drugs or survival needs. It's very important to recognize it does not have to be money. It could be a roof over somebody's head, which they will lose if they don't cooperate, or they will not have food. So it is not necessarily money, it's any kind of need that's being met. Okay, and child sex trafficking does not require the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. I know I've said that a lot, but it's very important to know that differentiation. Okay, so this is what's known as the AMP model, and that's defined as the A is the act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for labor services or commercial sex act. The M is for means, meaning force, fraud, or coercion. And P, the purpose is for exploitation, involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, slavery, or any commercial sex act involving a minor. Okay, so the area of focus for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is fourfold. The 4 Ps. The first is prevention, and that is to reduce the vulnerability of survivors through awareness, empowerment, and support, which is kind of what we're doing today. It's we want to reduce the demand for trafficked individuals so that human trafficking can be prevented. Protection is the government and non-governmental organizational support of survivors. And those are the many different organizations that work to identify people, to protect them, to advocate for them, and to provide care for survivors and to acknowledge and rehabilitate them. Prosecution, which is incredibly important, is to increase the certainty of conviction and opportunity cost, meaning that trafficking will be reduced when the cost of trafficking is more than its alternatives. And finally, it's partnership, which is tapping into the interconnectedness of all of the different groups that we represent, the multiple layers of authority in society to combat trafficking, and it's a combined effort across networks. The Bronx Human Trafficking Task Force, which we'll talk more about in a little while, is an example of a partnership. Okay, so what businesses are associated with sex trafficking? Some of this is not going to be a surprise. It's on the street via a trafficker or a gang-based prostitution. And I want to also mention when we talk about gangs that an individual might actually belong to a gang. So that individual, and again, it could be male or female, is passed around for sexual purposes throughout gang members, but also may be sold by the gang to outsiders so that they can get money out of the use of that individual. We see people at strip bars and clubs, escort services, pornography, live sex shows. These are all places where we may find people who are trafficked. We also will find people at major sporting events. People are often surprised at this, but at places like the Super Bowl and college sporting events, they're frequently coordinated with young people. Many young people attend these events. Think of a Taylor Swift concert also, where there may be young people and someone can approach them and offer them the opportunity to participate in getting money. And they can also approach other people with the opportunity to use the services of someone who's being trafficked. Within the United States, it's both males and females, citizens and non-citizens, and very often between 13 and 16 years of age. We also have seen can girls, which are the online sexual exploitation, resident-based commercial sex. We don't often think about this, but in some residential areas, someone may just have an apartment that's being used for trafficking, and people are in and out of that apartment all day using the people who reside or are being kept in that apartment. Also in storefront massage spas, health and beauty businesses. These are all very common signs. Other locations where victims may be trafficked for sex include truck stops. So this is where drivers who are driving cross country, for example, commercially, may have to stop for the night to sleep, and there they might be able to purchase someone. Similarly, in hotels and motels, we have learned in New York, for example, that there are some hotels that the rooms are rented for the entire day or night, and they're used to have different customers come back and forth through the rooms. It's common in casinos. I mentioned apartments and condos, and of course in brothels. In labor trafficking, this is also very common in domestic services, housekeeping, childcare. We see it in sweatshops and factories. We hear more and more about kids who are injured in burns, for example, because they're cooking, or fingers are chopped off because they're constructing. And recently there was an article in the Times about kids who are doing roofing and they're falling off the roofs and getting injured or killed. It's common in restaurants. It's common in begging when you're on the street. And what's interesting about that is sometimes you'll see people out very late, out so late, and it's because if a minimum amount of money isn't earned that day, they will not be allowed home. They will not be allowed to come in to eat their dinner or to spend the night. It's common in stripping, exotic dancing, just at the corner stores and bodegas, at butcher shops, common in nail salons and street vendors. So sometimes you will see someone opens up the gate in the morning. We saw this recently in a Chinese restaurant nearby, that the gate was open and there were already people inside who were getting ready to work for the day, obviously indicating that they had all spent the night there. Were they being trafficked? We don't know. Maybe they were just living there, but we do see these things very commonly. All right, so where does a lot of the scouting and recruiting occur? Now, remember, we're talking about youth. So there are telephone chat lines, lots of social media and chat rooms, at clubs and parties, just on the street, at shopping malls where kids hang out a lot, they may be approached. You want to make some money? Here's an opportunity for you. Sometimes on dates, their date will be the person who traffics them. There are traffickers who wait at schools and at after-school programs because they know young people may be coming out and no one is picking them up. They're on their own. At friends' houses, we've had instances of teens who were trafficked by their friends' parents, for example. At shelters, it's very common. We've done education at shelters, and frequently someone who resides there will come up and tell us, that's how I started. I was trafficked by a friend. Sometimes at group residential facilities and foster care, some of our partners have reported that while their territory is obviously free of this, as soon as their residents leave and go down the block, there are traffickers waiting because they know there are places where young people reside. It's common in juvenile justice centers and particularly common at bus stops or train stations where kids may be coming into a new city and may not know their way around. Right. Another place that we see this very often is that traffickers already know their victims. Right? And if we look at these signs on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see seeking young, attractive girls, no experience needed for job hassle-free. And some of the amount of money that's paid is higher than what people would expect to get. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. But we see this certainly where we are in the Bronx. These are posted on the lampposts and on different billboards for people to come and get their money. So the traffickers come from all walks of life. They're people of all races. There are immediate family members who traffic their kids. Sometimes this is in order for the family to survive, and it's a survival mechanism. Sometimes it's a money-making scheme. People are trafficked by boyfriends or friends of their family and neighbors, often by their employers or business owners, often by strangers, organized crime, gangs and criminal networks, and this is very dangerous. Businesses and recruiters can be women, girls, men, boys. Most victims are commonly approached by someone they know. This is not what you see in the movies that a stranger comes up to them. This is someone that they know, someone who is in their life. Okay, I'm going to pass on to Dr. Sherman, who's going to take over from here.
All right, hi, everyone. Good afternoon. According to the International Labor Organization, in 2021, there were approximately 27.6 million victims of human trafficking globally. It's a huge number, but it's only a rough estimate. Of these, 17.3 million are exploited in the private sector, 6.3 million in forced commercial sexual exploitation, and 3.9 million in labor imposed by the state in some countries around the world. Now, women and girls account for 4.9 million of those in forced commercial sexual exploitation, and for 6 million of those in forced labor and other economic sectors. And 12% of all those in forced labor are children. More than half of these children are involved in commercial sexual exploitation. So these numbers are very, very daunting. And we just put this up. These are all traffickers, people from all walks of life, all nationalities, all colors, men and women. There's no way to really tell who is a trafficker. So let's go through, we're going to spend a little time, a bit of time discussing the indicators of human trafficking, especially for those of you who are in service organizations. These are the clues that someone may be trafficked to. So first, does a person appear disconnected from family, friends, community organizations, or houses of worship? Victims are often isolated. Another indicator is that a child stopped attending school because they're working in labor. Has a person had a sudden or dramatic change in behavior because they're stressed out, they're depressed, they're scared from all of a sudden being trafficked? Is a juvenile engaged in commercial sex acts? Another one is a person disoriented or confused or showing signs of mental or physical abuse, because mental and physical abuse can be part of the trafficking. That leads next to, does a person have bruises in various stages of healing because they've been physically assaulted to be coerced into trafficking? Does a person appear fearful, timid, or submissive? Another sign. And does a person show signs of having been denied food, water, sleep, or medical care? Again, very, very isolated and disconnected from the normal parts of life. Going on, and further indicators of human trafficking is, in this, the first one is very, very key. Is a person often in the company of someone to whom he or she defers, or someone who seems to be in control of the situation, where they go or who they talk to? We see that in clinic. We'll have a teenager show up in clinic for a physical, and there'll be someone with them who is not a parent, who insists on being with them all the time. And of course, we separate the teenager from that adult because it's very suspicious of being trafficked. Does a person appear to be coached on what to say? In other words, they're coming up with like almost like a play, a script of what's going on, and it doesn't really make sense. Is a person living in unsuitable conditions or living with multiple people? That's another indication. Do they lack personal possessions and appear not to have a stable living situation? Their personal possessions may be taken away from them, so they can't leave. Does a person have freedom of movement? Can the person freely leave where they live? Are there unreasonable security measures? That's a big indicator. Of course, evidence of any violence, including bodily injuries such as broken bones, concussions, burns, bruising, bites, vaginal, anal tearing from violence, including assault, stabbing, rape, and unfortunately also torture. So there are barriers for identification. Many of the victims in the United States do not speak English, and that's a huge barrier. They're unable to communicate with service providers, police, or others who might be able to help them. So it's very, very important when you're working with such a victim to have the appropriate translation services. They're often kept isolated and their activities are restricted, and this is to prevent them from seeking help. Victims comply and don't seek help because they are told that their loved ones will be harmed. And their loved ones may be at home, maybe in another state, maybe in another city, or maybe even in another country. They may be in their home country. The traffickers have a very far reach, which is very frightening. Fear and shame might be another barrier. Self-blame and hopelessness. It's my fault. There's nothing I can do about it. And they may be dependent on the trafficker, not only for money, shelter, but emotionally. They may have created a emotional bond with the trafficker, almost like Stockholm syndrome. This is a video which is takes place in a medical clinic about a young girl. So let's start that.
Dale, niña, apúrate.
Mantén la boca cerrada que yo soy la que voy a hablar. Dale.
Is there something I can help you with?
Yes, my niece is sick. I don't know what's wrong with her.
Wait right here. Fill this out. And I'll get someone to take a look at her right away.
Thank you. Tú no le dices nada a nadie o ellos te van a llevar a la cárcel y bien lejos de tus padres. ¿Tú me entiendes?
Hi, I'm Anna Mitchell. Is this young lady who's not feeling well?
Yes, but she doesn't speak English. I'll translate for her.
That's okay, I speak Spanish. I'll tell you what, let me take her back to the examination room and find out what the problem is.
Okay, let's go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Patients only. It's clinic policy.
But she will be scared.
Cariño, no te preocupes. Estarás segura conmigo. She'll be fine. Siéntese aquí, por favor. ¿Cómo te llamas?
Pueblita.
Ok, Pueblita. Voy a checar tu corazón y respiración. ¿Está bien? Respira profunda. Muy bien. ¿Otra vez? Pueblita es un nombre muy bonito. ¿De dónde eres?
Honduras.
Honduras. Es muy lejos, ¿no? Was that your mother with you?
No. No. Yo trabajo para ella.
¿Qué tipo de trabajo haces?
Cosechamos tabaco.
¿Cosechas del tabaco? Es trabajo muy difícil para una niña.
Sí, pero lo tengo que hacer.
¿Por qué? Wait with her, I'll be right back. Todo estará bien.
So tattoo marks are part of trafficking. So all these tattoos are for people who've been trafficked. I mean, some of them are really amazing, like the barcode on the woman's neck, the tattoo on the woman's inner lips. You see the dollar sign, daddy's girl. This is amazing. The tattoos on the eyelids, upper eyelids of people. So it's pretty drastic. So survivors are looking for trust, safety, medical care, social support, and they may need basic life needs such as food and shelter. Obviously, mental health support is crucial. So they may be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, shame and grief, depression and hopelessness, anxiety disorders are common, self-destructive behaviors, and they may have traumatically bonded with the perpetrator. These are guiding principles. Read. Let me just move something aside. Of trauma-informed care. I'm not going to read through the whole verbiage in there, but we'll just go through the top headings and you guys can read through the different, a little more details. So first, in trauma-informed care, you have to have safety. Then you must have trustworthiness and transparency. Peer support and mutual self-help are crucial. You want to have collaboration and mutuality, empowerment of the victim, so they have a voice and they can make changes. And also you have to address historical in gender issues in terms of addressing trauma-informed care.
Peter,
Yeah.
I don't think the screen was being shared when you showed the photos of the with the markings of trafficking. Would you mind just sharing that for a few seconds so people can take a quick gander at it?
Okay.
Yes. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Please take a look at that because I think it's very telling. Okay. So we're going to talk about the equality model, which is very, very important. What happens when pimping, brothel owning, or sex buying is decriminalized or legalized? So it's totally decriminalized. And we have instances of where this has been done, and we have evidence of what happens. In countries where sex trade is fully decriminalized or legalized, trafficking inflows from other regions increase. Full decriminalization or legalization increases the demand for prostituted persons, causing the overall sex trade to grow. To legalize the sex trade is to normalize the sex trade, increasing overall social acceptance of the buying and selling of human beings. So just decriminalizing sex trade does not help. One of the most devastating consequences of the legalization or full decriminalization of the sex trade is also one of the most subtle. When we treat the buying or selling of other human beings as a victimless crime, or not a crime at all, we normalize it. Such normalization impacts the way men see vulnerable persons, particularly vulnerable women and girls of color. It also impacts the way that those who are bought, sold, exploited see themselves. So this is a comparison of the equality model versus full decriminalization. If we look at demand for prostitution in the equality model, the demand is reduced, but full decriminalization, the demand for prostitution is actually increased. Sex trafficking in the equality model is reduced. In full decriminalizations, it's actually increased. When we look at reports of incidents of violence against prostitute people, equality model doesn't apply, but for full decriminalization, we see increases in violence. If we look at the dedicated support services for survivors, once you build an equality model, you build in support for survivors. But that is not part of the full decriminalization. In societal attitudes, in the equality model, there is a increased belief in gender equality, but not in the full decriminalization model. So as we come near the end of the talk, this is the human trafficking hotline for the feds. I'll give you a minute for anyone who wants to take a snapshot or write that down. And this is another hotline. This is the National Human Trafficking Hotline, too. And you can take a minute to write that down. That is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And support is provided in more than 200 languages. So this is a very, very important resource. These are our resources, both national and local. This is a list of all the people on the Bronx Human Trafficking Task Force. It's one thing Diane and I are very proud about. We've really gotten a very wide representation of all sorts of CBOs that meet on a quarterly basis to address issues around trafficking in the Bronx, specifically focused on the Bronx. And we keep on having more and more people join. It's gotten a very good reputation out there. And as people hear about it, they call us and say, our organization would like to join. So if any of you are interested in starting a trafficking task force, we would be more than helpful to help with that. I think that is it. So we can open the floor to questions, thoughts, and comments.
Thank you both for your presentation. Truly appreciate that. We do have several questions that coming through in the chat. So let me see here. So someone's asking, could someone be charged with both labor and sex trafficking under federal law if an adult performing commercial sexual acts is having their labor exploited, in other words, sex work, or does the legislation define any forced commercial sex act exclusively as sex trafficking?
So the question is, can you be charged with both labor trafficking and sex trafficking? I kind of get that.
Yes, I think it's asking for both under the federal law.
I don't see why not, but the interesting thing is the way that the system works. The labor trafficking may be under a different agency than the sex trafficking too. So that might be a complication. That might be a challenge for a victim. The victims definitely want legal aid to help with some of these vagaries in terms of the law.
But there are individuals who may be trafficked, for example, to be a housekeeper, but then when they're not doing that, they're being trafficked sexually. So yes, then they're being trafficked for both sex and labor. So it does come up.
Thank you. How do you navigate addressing trafficking while avoiding harm to sex workers?
Good question.
Well,
Do you want to take a shot at that?
I'll take a shot at that one. What Dr. Sherman was just talking about in terms of the equality model versus complete decriminalization. For one thing, in complete decriminalization, nobody is blamed. Everybody is off the hook. The person who is being sold, the pimp, and the buyer, right? There's no crime. In the equality model, the prostitute is not charged, but the pimp and the buyer are charged. So one way to protect the person who's being prostituted is with the equality model. That way, the people who are doing the buying and the selling are the ones who are facing legal consequences. And that's very important. And again, I want to stress that it's both males and females who can be sold. And it is of all ages. Of course, we're focusing on youth because the youth do not have to prove force for coercion. But it's very difficult to protect from prosecution, but the federal law assists in that as well, because there is an opportunity for the individual, even though it may have looked like they were volunteering to participate, to prove that they were not, right? So that they are protected from being charged with a crime. Would you say that?
Yeah, someone made the comment that we should step away from the word prostitute and use sex worker.
Yeah.
Prostitute is a legal term.
Yeah.
That law enforcement will use. So I think that we're using in that context. When we're not talking in that context, we of course want to use the word sex workers.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for pointing that out and that distinction. Next question. So someone was inquiring about some things that happened in the past. So before magazines went online, you used to see teenagers and young adults going door to door selling magazine subscriptions. Was this a form of human trafficking that you're aware of? Basically, they heard years later that they were typically from out of town and forced to pay for their lodging out of their sales. Are you aware of that situation?
Yeah, I've read about that, and I believe that is true. That in some instances it was trafficking.
Okay, thank you. Does it seem, I guess in your opinion, does it seem like trafficking could be dealt with if there were improved processes for immigration, employment authorization, and work towards economic justice more broadly?
Yes. When you look at who is the most vulnerable, it's people who are not able to support themselves, right? And people who are trafficking will look for the people who are most vulnerable. And right now, because of the, just this week, I actually attended on Thursday, actually, at the Homeland Security. They had a conference on migrants and human trafficking, and the fact that migrants are particularly vulnerable because when they arrive, we were focused on New York, but when they arrive, they have no way to support themselves. They're completely dependent. And so if it was a more efficient system to allow people to gain employment, then they would not be as vulnerable to human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, any of it. But at some point, people become desperate and will do whatever they need to do to support themselves and their families. So yes.
Thank you. We have a few questions just in general regarding the equality model, and wondering if you might be able to elaborate on that, like what are the steps being taken towards the equality model? And then there were some concerns in that the equality model might in fact perpetuate harm against sex workers. I'm not sure if you're able to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't consider myself an expert in the equality model. I'm not aware what is happening in other parts of the country. In terms of harm, the model has been studied.
Yeah.
It's not that people have developed the model and just put it out there. It has been studied. So when we see that there is a decrease in harm to sex workers, that is something that has been studied in the equality model. For example, it was in Amsterdam, I think, was one of the major places where they put through the equality model, and they actually studied it and found that it was safer for sex workers to use that model.
And one related to that, in Denmark, they actually decriminalized sex work altogether, right? And what they found was because now that it was legal, sex work increased and trafficking increased because now there was no reason not to. And so trafficking increased because more people wanted to make money. Whereas in those places where the sex worker is not arrested, but the purchaser and the seller are arrested, there's a disincentive for them to bring more people into trafficking. And there have been studies. It's sometimes, you can look it up, sometimes it's also called the Nordic model, because a lot of work was done in Scandinavia, particularly with Denmark going into complete decriminalization.
Thank you, Diane. Question regarding tattoo shops. So they're wondering if there are trainings that you or maybe you're aware of for tattoo shops on human trafficking. Is that a thing, or do human traffickers usually do the tattoos themselves?
That's a good question. I don't know, but one thing I can say that, for example, in New York City, they have services to remove the tattoos for free. So you can have the tattoo removed for free. But I'm not so. I think, well, from looking at the pictures of tattoos I've seen, clearly some of them are being done by amateurs, and clearly some are being done by professionals. So I think it runs a whole gamut about where and how people are getting tattooed.
But there are actual tattoo artists who are volunteering to do the removal.
Great. Thank you for that. How does decriminalizing sex trade interact with decriminalizing sex work?
So decriminalize sex trade and sex work. The decriminalization has been focused at the decriminalizing the sex worker, not the sex trade, decriminalizing sex trade, I'm just kind of guessing a little about what is behind that question, would be decriminalizing the whole trade like it has happened in some countries in Europe. Does that make sense?
The question is, it's a little confusing because, you know, for example, there's the whole issue of sex tourism and where that might fit into it as well, particularly in Myanmar. We've been working with somebody there. The decriminalization just basically makes sex work and the buying and the selling legal. Right? And again, as we mentioned, in the studies that have been conducted, that has not been as effective as just making the sex worker not criminalized, but the purchaser and the seller are still criminalized. So I'm not quite sure what the intent of that question is. If you reword it, I'd be happy to rethink it.
Thank you. All right, more questions coming in. So under the labor trafficking definition given in the beginning, wouldn't prisons and immigration detention centers be considered labor traffickers? Are they exempt from federal law?
The persons in immigration centers be considered labor traffickers? I don't
understand.
Yeah, I
the
don't quite
question.
get that. Usually the persons in immigration centers are victims of trafficking.
Is there more?
Yeah, it was an anonymous question, so if
Okay.
they would like to further clarify, feel free to put something in the Q&A for that. Thank you. One person asked, how can they approach their patients safely in the clinic when they suspect trafficking? And I think that might have been a little bit addressed in the video that we missed, but the link for that will be shared out. But if you wouldn't mind addressing the question.
Yeah, so when we have someone who we suspect being trafficked in the clinic, it's very important to separate them from whoever else they're with, that you have to really interview them on an individual basis and make sure, see if you can get them to kind of talk about what they're involved with. It can be very, very difficult. It's very, very stigmatized. There are a lot of reasons people don't want to talk about it. So it doesn't mean just because you're asked, you're going to get success. If you do ask and someone says that they've been trafficked and they want it out, there are a lot of resources. For example, in our area, we have tons of resources. A lot is because we run the task force. But you want to know what are the resources in your area. So if that happens in a clinical setting, you know where to call. Whether, you know, for example, are you going to call Homeland Security? Are you going to call the local police department? Are you going to call the FBI? Are you going to call a local trafficking organization? Like Safe Horizons is a CBO in our area that does that. And you have to be familiar with what each agency does, because you don't want to refer someone to an agency where it's going to be punitive. You want to send them to an agency where they will be supported in a non-punitive manner. Now, so, for example, we're very secure using Homeland Security because they are non-punitive. They're not going to arrest someone who's being trafficked, and we've used them. We used them a while ago for a young teenager who was on our inpatient unit who had been trafficked, and they were very, very good at kind of interviewing the person and getting help. So it's very important to know your resources.
Other than tattoos, what are some of the other physical attributes on the body that could be a sign of trafficking?
Well, most importantly are possible injuries in various stages of healing, not just one single injury. But if, for example, you're treating somebody with burns and they come into the ED because they have a burn today, and then you see that there are other burns. So trying to understand why is there more than one. So that's very important. You also have to remember that sometimes you're not going to see evidence because traffickers want their product, so to speak, to look good. So they may be very careful not to leave marks. And that's why you may sometimes see head injuries, because head injuries don't leave marks. And so that's another thing to look for. And again, as we described before, you might see vaginal tearing, anal tearing, just general signs of bruising. But again, you have to know, where did these marks come from? And sometimes, and in all honesty, the patient may lie to you, even if the trafficker is not there. One thing, for example, that you may find is that the patient, unbeknownst to you, may be leaving his or her phone on, and the trafficker may be listening to everything that's being said. And so you may not be getting the full story because the individual is afraid to give it. So you're looking for the physical, but you're also looking for the tentativeness. The individual may avoid answering some questions because they know that if they answer these questions honestly, they're going to get into trouble.
And also remember, injuries can be the result of two things. It may be the result of an abusive relationship, or it may be an occupational injury too. So you have to kind of separate those two out.
Excuse me. And just a reminder for any questions that we don't get to as we approach the end of the hour, we will have those addressed by our speakers and they will be sent out, emailed to you directly. Are there any success stories that you can share with us?
Yeah. Yes, one I can think of, and I know you've had some success stories from the shelters where people have come up to you, but we had a teenager admitted from the emergency room. She was being trafficked, so we admitted her for safety, and then we got Homeland Security involved, and we were able to get her placed back in her mother's home. Now, we're not sure what the long-term outcome was, but at least we were able to get her to a place of safety. And there was actually not only Homeland Security showed up, NYPD, the FBI. There was a huge amount of interest in the case and trying to help this young teenager too. So that was really, really gratifying to see these agencies approaching it in a sensitive manner. They were not heavy-handed. They did a really nice job.
Yeah. It's very gratifying to, I never thought I would be working with Homeland Security and the FBI. And yet working with these individuals, there's a tremendous commitment. One of the things that was discussed in great detail at the meeting last week with Homeland Security is that people who are trafficked and who are undocumented are not deported. That's not the intention of Homeland Security. And in fact, there is a special visa that individuals who are undocumented or who are not here legally can get if they are being trafficked, and it will delay any legal action taken, and they will be eligible for legal services. There are many groups that are providing legal services, and so there is a real interest from Homeland Security and the FBI and the police in protecting these individuals. This is not an effort to deport people, just the opposite. I was very, very impressed with the way that they spoke about their commitment to taking care of people who are trafficked.
Because they know if they don't take a protective stance, this will be covered up and remain hidden. So it's very important that they take that protective stance.
Yeah. And when the case that Dr. Sherman is talking about, Homeland Security actually came here and they stood here the whole night to make sure that nobody came for this young woman and that she didn't decide to leave because she was afraid to stay. Right? So they were very gentle with her and very, very helpful. Are there any other questions?
We actually had quite a few additional questions, but for the sake of time, we have made note of the questions, and we will send those directly to you, Peter and Diane,
Okay.
and for you to answer, and we'll make sure that we do get those out to everybody. So,
And we're happy to answer those.
Absolutely, yeah.
thank you. All right, and so that does wrap up the Q&A portion of our presentation. So thank you very much for joining us. Quickly would like to make mention that we do have our annual 10th annual conference on adolescent health offered through the Adolescent Health Initiative, which is going to be on May 6th and 7th. There is a link there for you to learn more information. We are also accepting nominations for our 2024 Excellence in Health Award, and more information can be found on our website there. Here is the link to the survey. At the end of the survey, there will be an opportunity to enter your email so that you can receive a certificate of completion for this webinar. Again, the webinar has been recorded and will be sent to you along with the answers to the questions and the slides to the PowerPoint. Thank you all, everyone. Thank you so much, Peter and Diane, for joining us today for this webinar. We truly appreciate your time. Thank you, folks, thank you, folks, for joining us as well. We appreciate your time too.
Thank you for
Have
having
a great day.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.